We've just got some breaking news in from Buckingham Palace, folks. So this statement has just come in from Buckingham Palace, and I'll read it for you. It goes on to say, His Majesty has today initiated a formal process to remove the style, titles, and...
The message reached Meghan without ceremony, without warning, and without any comforting language to soften what it meant. One palace order had severed her final physical connection to Britain, while another decision struck directly at Harry's identity. In a matter of minutes, the couple who had once stood at the center of royal life were confronted with the most brutal possibility yet. The institution had decided there would be no road back. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Meghan held the palace document in both hands and read it again, slower this time. The wording was cold, precise, and impossible to mistake. Under the fictional order, she was permanently barred from entering British territory in connection with royal events, royal residences, or any privilege connected to the institution she had once joined through marriage. Harry stood a few steps away, watching her face change as the meaning settled in. This was not a cancelled invitation or another temporary restriction. It was written as a permanent separation. Harry reached for the second document and felt his own shock turn into something harder. His remaining princely title and royal styling had been formally removed within the dramatized decision, stripping away words that had followed him since birth. A royal styling is simply the official form of address attached to a member of the monarchy, and losing it meant the palace was no longer treating his position as part of the active royal structure. For him, the wound was not only ceremonial. Britain was the country of his childhood, his mother's memory, his military service, and generations of family history. Now the language in front of him suggested that even those emotional ties could no longer protect his place. Meghan reached the final paragraph and stopped, her hands lowered. The clause at the bottom made clear that the restriction was not tied to one visit, one dispute, or one moment of anger. It had been approved at the highest level and written to remain in force. She placed the pages face down on the table, but the gesture did nothing to lessen their weight. Harry crossed the room without speaking, his jaw tightening as he realized there was no sentence offering review, negotiation, or a route back. Then another detail changed everything. Harry noticed that his title removal and Meghan's exclusion carried matching release language and the same effective date. The two decisions had not simply happened beside each other. They had been deliberately presented as one historic break between the Sussexes and the palace. That realization cut deeper than either document alone, because it suggested the institution wanted the world to understand that husband and wife were being separated from royal life together. Meghan finally looked toward him, her disbelief giving way to visible grief. Harry's anger rose just as quickly. Yet neither of them knew which royal figure had pushed hardest for the final wording, who had resisted, or whose silence had allowed it to pass. Somewhere inside the palace, 3 senior royals had already made choices that would now define what happened next. The order had landed, but the deeper wound lay in the people behind it, and in the personal history that made this decision far more than a matter of royal paperwork. Behind the titles, signatures, and palace walls were 3 people bound by family and divided by years of resentment. Harry was not simply losing a royal designation. He was watching part of his birthright disappear. Meghan was not merely facing exclusion. She was being told that the country where she married into the monarchy had permanently shut its doors. And Charles now faced the cost of choosing institution over reconciliation. Harry stayed near the table where the documents had been left, but his anger was beginning to give way to something heavier. Britain had never been just a place on a passport to him. It was where he had grown up inside the monarchy, where memories of his mother remained tied to palaces and public duty, and where his years of military service had given him an identity beyond royal ceremony. A princely title, in simple terms, was more than a form of address in his world. It connected him to the royal family structure he had been born into. Losing it felt personal, because it suggested that the institution no longer recognized the version of himself that had existed before everything broke apart. Harry finally told Meghan what had been building inside him. Losing the title, he said quietly, did not feel like losing a few words from his name. It felt as though his father had drawn a line through his old life and declared that chapter finished. She listened without interrupting, because Britain carried its own complicated meaning for her. It was the country where she had married into the royal family, stepped onto the public stage, faced relentless pressure, and ultimately left after years of conflict. Now the place connected to both her rise and her suffering had become somewhere the palace said she could no longer return in the same way. Charles carried a different kind of weight. Confirmation had already reached him that the order was delivered, yet he remained alone with the final approval file longer than expected. A documented fictional palace account recorded that the king had demanded one last review before signing off, forcing advisors to examine whether any narrower option remained. He removed his glasses, reread Harry's name, and placed his pen beside the page. When an aide quietly asked whether anything should be changed, the monarch did not answer. He simply closed the file. Meghan soon learned another detail that sharpened the sense of rejection. Her restriction had originally been discussed as a separate matter from Harry's title, with different advisors reviewing each issue. Only later were the two decisions merged into one institutional response, making husband and wife part of the same final judgment. She understood immediately what that meant. The palace had wanted no confusion about the message being sent. Harry felt betrayed. Meghan felt shut out. Charles had chosen not to reverse the decision, but the silence surrounding his final review revealed that the choice had not come easily. And beneath all three reactions sat one question that could no longer be avoided. What had happened behind closed doors that convinced the palace there was nothing left to save? That silence inside the palace did not begin with this order. It began weeks earlier, during one private confrontation that would later be remembered as the moment everything changed. Every royal rupture has a moment people later identify as the beginning of the end. In this story, it was not a ceremony, a speech, or a public scandal. It was a private call. Voices stayed low, no cameras were present, and only a handful of people ever learned exactly what was said. Yet by the time the conversation ended, the palace had crossed an invisible line, and Harry had no idea how permanent the consequences would become. Harry entered that call expecting one more difficult compromise, not a final warning. Relations had already been strained by arguments over security, royal status, public appearances, and how far he and Meghan could continue using connections tied to the monarchy after stepping away from official duties. Those disputes mattered because each one touched the same deeper question. Were they still partly inside the royal structure, or had the palace decided they belonged completely outside it? For months, advisors had tried to define those boundaries, while Charles resisted anything permanent, hoping time might soften the conflict between his son and the institution. Then the conversation changed. Harry was told that Meghan would not be included in an upcoming family gathering at a major royal residence, and the explanation immediately pushed him from frustration into anger. A royal residence, in simple terms, is a property used by the monarch or senior members of the family for official or private purposes, so exclusion carried more weight than missing an ordinary invitation. It signaled who the palace still considered safely inside the family circle. Meghan listened nearby as the words landed, and her hurt quickly hardened into determination. She told him quietly not to accept another arrangement that treated her presence as something the palace could approve or remove whenever it wished. Harry stopped trying to soften his response. During the recorded fictional call, he told the senior royal representative that if Meghan was formally excluded again, He would publicly reject every remaining palace restriction attached to his royal identity. The statement was blunt, emotional, and impossible to misunderstand. He believed he was drawing a line in defense of his wife. Inside the palace, however, the remark was treated as something much more serious. The representative documented the exact exchange and immediately forwarded the written account to senior officials. Charles received that account later and understood at once why advisors were alarmed. He had resisted permanent action because, beneath everything, he still hoped private negotiation might save some part of the relationship. But Harry's ultimatum now looked like proof that every compromise could become another public confrontation. The king read the summary twice, paused over the final paragraph, and recognized that the argument had shifted from family tension to institutional control. Harry ended the call abruptly, set the phone down, and turned toward Meghan. "They've already made their choice," he said, unaware that the palace was preserving his own words as evidence of the moment negotiations had collapsed. She looked back at him with the same certainty now forming inside her. Neither of them knew that those few sentences would soon be treated as the point of no return. The phone call had created the trigger, but the real explosion came when Harry finally faced the man whose approval could either stop the punishment or make it permanent. There were no photographers when Harry faced Charles. No balcony, no uniforms, no ceremony to disguise what the meeting truly was. It was a father and son, carrying years of disappointment into one closed room. Harry wanted the palace to acknowledge what Meghan had endured. Charles wanted his son to understand that the monarchy could not survive endless personal negotiations. Neither man entered willing to surrender. Harry arrived already carrying the anger from the private call, but the room forced that anger into something sharper. Two aides remained only long enough to place briefing papers on the table before leaving father and son alone. The documents formed part of a fictional royal review, a formal process examining whether he could continue holding a royal title while openly rejecting the conditions attached to that status. That mattered, because the argument was no longer only about Meghan's treatment. It had become a question of whether personal defiance and royal identity could still exist side by side. Harry did not wait long before speaking. He told his father that every punishment directed at Meghan landed on him too, because the palace kept treating his marriage as something separate from his position. He refused to accept a future where she could be excluded, while he was expected to preserve the symbols of royal belonging. Charles listened without interrupting, but his silence only made the prince more frustrated. For Harry, the issue was family. For the king, it had become an institutional boundary that could no longer move every time emotions changed. Charles finally answered in a voice far quieter than his son expected. He said the monarchy could not allow personal conflict to override decisions made in the name of the crown. The crown, in plain terms, meant the monarchy as an institution rather than simply one individual wearing a crown. That distinction mattered because he was telling Harry something painful. He was speaking not only as a father, but as the man responsible for protecting the system his son was challenging. Then the warning became far more serious. Charles told him that Meghan's permanent exclusion was already under formal consideration. Harry froze because he had believed the dispute concerned invitations, residences, and specific future appearances. Permanence changed everything. He pushed his chair backward and stared at his father, demanding to know whether the palace truly intended to close Britain to his wife for good. The monarch remained seated, folded his hands, and said the review had moved beyond temporary restrictions. Harry asked the question he had been avoiding. Was his own title under review too? Charles did not answer. The silence lasted only seconds, but it was enough. Harry saw the truth before his father found the words. His anger faltered into disbelief because this was no longer a threat designed to force compromise. The palace was already considering a future in which his wife was excluded, and his own royal identity was formally reduced. Charles struggled to keep his expression controlled. He had wanted his son to understand the seriousness of the situation without destroying whatever remained between them. Yet the meeting had done the opposite. And Harry still did not know that the decision was moving beyond one father's personal authority. The confrontation ended without reconciliation, and beyond that closed door, the monarchy's machinery was already preparing a decision neither man could easily undo. Royal power rarely arrives with shouting. It moves through briefings, legal language, sealed folders, and carefully chosen signatures. While Harry and Meghan focused on the emotional betrayal, senior figures inside the palace were examining something colder: authority. Could one family dispute now threaten the boundaries of the crown itself? The answer would determine not only Meghan's access to Britain, but whether Harry could continue carrying a title the institution believed he no longer represented. William received the recommendation after the confrontation between father and son had already failed. The fictional palace review was a formal internal process in which senior advisors examined constitutional, ceremonial, and reputational risks before presenting a final course of action to the monarch. That mattered because the decision was no longer being treated as a private family punishment. Advisors were now asking whether years of repeated negotiation had weakened the line between personal freedom and royal responsibility. William became central because the future of the monarchy was being used as the strongest argument for ending that uncertainty. He read the pages alone and slowed when he reached the section carrying Harry's name. The prince understood the institutional logic, but he also understood what a signature could cost. His brother might see it not as a professional judgment, but as proof that family loyalty had finally been sacrificed to the crown. He pressed his thumb against the edge of the paper and remained there for several seconds. Charles still searched for another way. He asked senior advisors whether Meghan's restriction could remain limited to specific royal events, while Harry retained some form of title recognition. The king's question exposed the burden he had tried to hide during the earlier confrontation. He was not eager to make the break permanent, but the response was severe. Previous compromises had created new arguments, new exceptions, and new public disputes. Another partial measure, advisors warned, would only delay the same crisis. Then the recommendation revealed its hardest condition. Meghan's permanent exclusion and Harry's title removal had to be approved together. Separating the two, the document argued, would leave the palace trapped in the same unresolved struggle over who remained inside royal life and who did not. One decision would close access. The other would close status. Together, they would create the clear institutional separation advisors believed had been missing for years. William understood exactly what that meant. He did not sign in anger, and he did not celebrate the outcome. He supported it because he believed the monarchy could not pass the same conflict from one reign into the next, forcing future generations to renegotiate boundaries that should already have been settled. Finally, he placed his signature beneath the recommendation without calling anyone into the room. Charles received the completed papers afterward and paused before giving his own approval. The choice was now narrower than ever. Once he signed, there would be no easy return to temporary measures, private understandings, or carefully managed exceptions. The signatures were now complete, and within hours the consequences escaped the palace file and entered Harry and Meghan's daily lives. The true weight of a royal punishment is rarely felt in the announcement itself. It arrives afterward, in cancelled plans, altered names, unanswered calls, and the sudden realization that old assumptions no longer apply. For Harry, the title loss becomes real when a familiar form of address disappears from official correspondence. For Meghan, the exclusion becomes real when a future journey to Britain is no longer a difficult possibility, but something formally closed. Harry opened the revised letter and stopped at the heading. The title that had followed him for most of his life was gone. He read the line once, then again, as if the words might change if he looked long enough. Official correspondence mattered because it was where royal status became practical, not symbolic. The way a person was addressed showed whether the institution still recognized that position. This time, the palace had made the change unmistakable. Harry handed the page to Meghan without speaking. She understood immediately why the silence felt heavier than anger. He had lived through public criticism, family arguments, security disputes, and years of distance from royal life, but some part of him had still believed his birth identity would remain untouched. He finally admitted that he never expected the palace to remove it completely. For him, the loss felt less like changing a label and more like watching another link to his childhood disappear. Meghan tried to steady him, but her own notification arrived with a different kind of finality. Future attendance at royal-linked events in Britain would not be authorized under the fictional permanent restriction. The notice went further than she expected. It was not tied to one ceremony, one residence, or even one monarch's personal schedule. Its language was written to survive future changes, meaning the boundary would remain even if circumstances inside the royal family shifted later. Meghan held herself together until the conversation turned to their children. Then the weight broke through. She told Harry that what hurt most was imagining them growing up with Britain as something distant and complicated, rather than part of their living family story. That possibility struck deeply because the country was tied to his upbringing, his mother's memory, and generations of family history. For her, it was also the place where marriage had once opened the door to royal life, before years of pressure eventually pushed them away. Harry felt the urge to fight back immediately. For a moment, he considered returning to Britain and challenging the decision in full public view. But the new language changed his thinking. A confrontation could now make the palace more determined, not less, and turn personal grief into another institutional battle. So he made a choice no one around him expected. Harry reached for his phone and asked for direct contact with Charles. No lawyers, no aides, no briefing papers. He wanted one final conversation with his father before deciding what came next. For the first time since the order was issued, anger gave way to something quieter. And that change opened the door to one final conversation between father and son. By the time Harry spoke to Charles again, there were no advisors left to blame, and no palace language to hide behind. The decision had already been made. The documents had already moved. What remained was painfully simple. A son asking his father whether the relationship beneath the monarchy still existed. For once, neither man argued about titles first. They spoke about family, absence, anger, and everything the institution had failed to repair. Harry had asked for one condition before the call began. No aides, no lawyers, no secretaries, no one else listening in. He wanted his father, not the institution surrounding him. That mattered because the formal process was already over. A formal decision, in this context, meant the palace action had passed beyond discussion and into effect, leaving neither man able to pretend this was another round of negotiation. There was nothing left to bargain with. Only the damage remained. Harry spoke first about his children. He said he could survive losing the title, even if the loss still hurt more than he wanted to admit. What he struggled to accept was the thought that Britain might become a place they associated only with distance, rejection, and closed doors. For him, that country carried childhood memories, military service, family history, and the shadow of his mother. Losing official status was one wound. Watching those connections fade for the next generation felt like another. Charles listened longer than before. When he finally answered, his voice carried none of the cold formality that had marked their earlier confrontation. He admitted that the separation between father and son had become one of the most painful consequences of his reign. Yet he did not offer reversal. The king made clear that the decision would stand because changing it now would pull the monarchy straight back into the same cycle of exceptions, negotiations, and public conflict they had just tried to end. Then Harry asked the question beneath every other question. After a long silence, he said, "Am I still your son before I am anything else?" Charles answered without hesitation. Yes. The simplicity of that response changed the room between them. He explained that removing Harry's title had been meant as an institutional boundary, not a declaration that the family bond had disappeared. The distinction did not erase the hurt, but it gave the prince something he had not expected from the call: clarity. Harry surprised his father in return. He stopped demanding immediate reversal. Instead, he said he would no longer build his future around waiting for palace approval, or measuring his worth through a title the institution had already taken away. Charles understood what those words meant. His son was not surrendering. He was letting go. For the first time, fury gave way to acceptance on both sides, even though reconciliation remained incomplete. And just as father and son reached that quiet understanding, the palace decision was about to become public. Their private exchange brought no reversal. But when the decision became public, millions of people were about to interpret that silence in their own way. By morning, the private wound had become a national spectacle. Broadcasters abandoned ordinary schedules. Newspaper editors tore up planned front pages. Outside royal landmarks, supporters and critics gathered beneath the same gates, with completely different interpretations of what had happened. To some, the palace had finally defended the monarchy. To others, it had transformed a family dispute into permanent exile. One image captured the division more powerfully than any statement. Harry watched the coverage from abroad and felt the decision become real in a way the documents had not managed. British broadcasters led with the twin announcement: Meghan's permanent exclusion under the fictional palace order, and the removal of his remaining royal title and style. A royal style is the formal way a member of the monarchy is officially addressed, so its disappearance signaled more than a change in wording. It showed that the institution now wanted the separation reflected publicly, consistently, and without ambiguity. The debate moved quickly. Commentators argued over whether the palace had finally imposed necessary discipline or allowed a family conflict to harden into something almost impossible to repair. Harry listened as presenters spoke about him largely in the past tense, describing what he had once represented within royal life rather than what he still was. Then one on-screen caption appeared without the title he had known all his life. He stared at it for several seconds, reached for the remote, and switched the television off. Meghan lasted even less time with the coverage. She heard one discussion turn toward whether she should ever have been allowed back into royal circles after earlier disputes, and immediately ended it. She refused to sit while strangers debated whether she deserved access to a country tied to her marriage, her children, and years of personal conflict. Harry saw the hurt beneath her restraint. But this time she did not answer the criticism. She walked away from it. Then one fictional front page captured the mood of the morning. The Crown Chronicle appeared with the words, "The Final Divide," stretched across its lead story, placing Harry's name beside the gates of Buckingham Palace. The image reduced years of family tension into one brutal message: one side outside, one institution inside. For supporters of the monarchy, it looked like firmness. For critics, it looked like a door being closed forever. Outside Buckingham Palace, the division became even more personal. A small crowd gathered near the railings, and one supporter placed two handwritten signs beside each other. One read, "Protect the Crown." The other read, "Family First." People stopped to photograph them because together they said what hours of commentary could not. Britain was not reacting with one voice. Harry eventually looked back toward Meghan. and neither needed to discuss the headlines again. The palace had made its statement. The public had chosen sides. What remained was theirs alone. When the cameras moved on and the palace gates emptied, only one question mattered. Not whether the old life could be restored, but whether Harry and Meghan would finally stop trying to return to it. In the end, there was no reversal, no dramatic last-minute rescue, and no secret agreement waiting behind another palace door. Meghan remained permanently outside the royal path back to Britain. Harry's title did not return. The monarchy had drawn the hardest boundary of the entire conflict, and the couple finally understood what the order truly represented. It was not another warning. It was an ending, and with that ending came a painful kind of freedom. Meghan closed the palace file for the final time and pushed it away. The fictional order remained fully in force, meaning her exclusion was permanent under its terms, and Harry's removed title would not be restored. That mattered because the conflict had finally moved beyond temporary punishment or negotiation. The palace had chosen a fixed institutional boundary, while the couple now had to decide whether they would keep measuring their future against a system that had already made its decision. Harry looked at the unopened pages and understood what he was really grieving. The title had been tied to his childhood, his mother, his military years, and his place inside the royal family long before the conflict began. Losing it still hurt, but continuing to fight for recognition would keep his family trapped inside the same cycle of rejection, anger, and hope. Meghan told him quietly that she no longer wanted their lives judged by whether the palace accepted them. This time, he did not argue. Charles carried the cost differently. He kept a private copy of the final correspondence, rather than ordering it removed with the rest of the completed paperwork. The gesture changed nothing officially, but it revealed something the final decision could not erase. The king had ended the institutional argument, yet he had not erased the emotional bond with his son. He understood that duty had given him certainty while taking away something deeply personal. William accepted his own loss as well. Protecting the crown had meant supporting a decision he believed would prevent the same conflict from reaching the next generation. The crown, in this final sense, meant the monarchy as a continuing institution rather than one individual or one reign. But the prince also knew there was a price. Whatever remained of the easy brotherhood he once shared with Harry could not simply return because time passed. Meghan finally stood. Harry looked once more at the palace file, then left it untouched on the table as he joined his family. That simple choice carried the final meaning of everything that had happened. The monarchy had chosen certainty over reconciliation. The couple had chosen a life no longer dependent on royal status. No one truly won. The crown became more controlled. The family became more divided. And the battle that had consumed them finally ended, because there was nothing left to negotiate. There would be no return to the old arrangement, no restored title, and no final palace reconciliation. The monarchy had protected its boundaries. Harry and Meghan had lost their place within them, and all four people at the heart of the conflict were left to live with a choice that permanently changed the meaning of family, duty, and the crown. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.